It's Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, where we provide tailor-made solutions for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies by improving their quality of life, and where we also provide tailor-made solutions to hospitals and intensive care units to save money and resources whilst providing quality care. In the last blog I shared a report from the ABC, where the ABC highlights once again that home healthcare is cheaper and safer. You can check out this article in last week's blog by clicking on the link below this video. So the name of the blog was ABC Reports: Home Healthcare Cheaper and Safer. In this week's blog I want to ask you, is an NFR, or not for resuscitation order, or a withdrawal of treatment, quote unquote, in the best interest for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care? For most long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care, some rather significant questions arise sooner or later. Questions around quality of life or quality of care will inevitably come up sooner or later. Questions around perceived alternatives or non-perceived alternatives come usually up as well. Over the many years that I've worked in intensive care as well as in the intensive home care space, I have witnessed many situations where medically stable, long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care were deemed as quote unquote too difficult to be weaned off the ventilator and off the tracheostomy. Hence, they were perceived to not being able to leave intensive care. They were also deemed to have no quality of life, and therefore a withdrawal of treatment would be quote unquote in their best interest, or in the best interest for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies. Sadly, those points of views are often limited by a strict clinical and intensive care paradigm. Once a long-term stay in intensive care is on the horizon for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies, all sorts of rationalizations go through clinicians' minds, and they are completely missing the point. Yes, in some instances a withdrawal of treatment or an NFR, not for resuscitation order, might be quote unquote in the best interest of a long-term ventilated patient with tracheostomy in intensive care. However, this can only ever be truthfully decided upon once all genuine alternatives have been explained to a patient and their family. Most clinicians in intensive care, and that's including doctors and nurses, are still thinking that a critically ill patient in intensive care has two options. Let's look at those options in detail. The first option clinicians perceive to have is that a critically ill patient is survive their critical illness and recover to the point where they can leave intensive care and go to a hospital ward. The second perceived alternative for a critically ill patient in intensive care is that they approach their end of life in intensive care and consequently die in ICU. This is very limited thinking from my point of view, and doesn't consider other viable options that provide a win-win situation for all stakeholders when it comes to long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care. For any of the growing numbers of long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies in intensive care, the question shouldn't be about limiting or withdrawing treatment, or it shouldn't be about an NFR, a not for resuscitation order. It should be about creating a viable option where everybody is winning. Thankfully, we at Intensive Care at Home have created such a viable win-win situation, and we can provide home care for medically stable, long-term ventilated intensive care patients with tracheostomies at home. This gives patients and their families choice beyond the current limited intensive care paradigm. It frees up precious, scarce and expensive intensive care beds. It saves hospitals, departments of health and private health funds to pay a premium up to $5,000 per bed day, and it gives patients and their families a much improved quality of life in their own home. What are your thoughts? Do you think that an NFR order or a withdrawal of treatment is quote-unquote in the best interest of long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies? What do you think are the alternatives? Leave your comments on the blog. For more information, check out our website intensivecareathome.com.au, or you can contact me with an email at patrick@intensivecareathome.com.au. That's Patrick with a K at the end. Or you can ring me on 041 094 2230. We are also currently hiring enthusiastic and experienced intensive care nurses, ideally with a critical care certificate, for our ventilated clients in Melbourne. We have full-time, part-time and casual positions available. We would also like to hear from you if you have a minimum of 2 years pediatric ICU experience, as we have opportunities there as well. For more information, check out our career section, or you can contact me. Or you can contact me if you want to know more about how we can help you, your intensive care unit, your patients and your families, or if you have a family member in intensive care that's ventilated with a tracheostomy. I would strongly recommend you check out our website and contact us for more information. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog. This is Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, and I see you again next week in another update.